She buried her husband alone, and when she asked her own son for a ride home, he told her to call an Uber. That same night, while her family drank wine beside a warm fireplace, 70-year-old Eleanor lay freezing in a dark house with no heat, fighting for her life. By morning, the entire country knew their names. Eleanor spent most of her life believing that love meant sacrifice, not temporary sacrifice, not the kind where you give a little and eventually receive something back. She believed real love meant giving until there was nothing left of yourself. It meant waking up before everyone else and sleeping after everyone else. It meant making sure every person around you was comfortable even when you were exhausted, hungry, overwhelmed, or breaking inside. For decades, that belief shaped every decision she made. When she was young, she had dreams that belonged only to her. She wanted to become a teacher. She loved school. She loved learning. She imagined herself standing in front of a classroom one day, helping children discover their potential. For a girl who came from a modest background, college represented freedom and identity. It was proof that her future could become something bigger than survival. But life changed quickly. She fell in love young, got married young, and became pregnant before she had time to truly understand what she was giving up. The moment she became a mother, her own dreams quietly moved to the background. Not because anyone forced her directly, but because that is what women of her generation were taught to do. Responsibilities came first. Family came first. The baby came first. There was always something more urgent than her education, her ambitions, or her personal happiness. She convinced herself it was temporary at first. She told herself she would eventually return to college once things settled down. But life never settled down. There was always another bill to pay, another emergency, another sacrifice that needed to be made. When her first husband abandoned her, she did not collapse. She did not have the luxury to collapse. She had a small child depending on her. She worked exhausting shifts at a diner for terrible pay, came home physically destroyed, slept only a few hours, and woke up to do it all over again. During those years, survival became her only goal. She stopped asking herself what she wanted from life because wanting things felt dangerous. Wanting things only led to disappointment. So she learned to survive instead. Then Arthur entered her life. Calm, dependable Arthur. He gave her stability when her entire world had been chaos. He loved Michael as if he were his own son. He worked hard, stayed loyal, and created a sense of safety she had not experienced in years. For the first time, Eleanor felt like she could breathe again. But even in that stability, her identity continued revolving around other people. She became a wife again, a mother again, a caretaker again. Everything she did centered on making life easier for the people she loved. She managed every detail of the household with almost invisible precision. She stretched every dollar. She repaired clothes instead of replacing them. She skipped buying things for herself so Michael could have school supplies, sports equipment, and opportunities she never had growing up. Every sacrifice seemed justified because it was for him. She believed that was what motherhood meant. To love someone so deeply that their future mattered more than your own comfort. When Michael got older and college became possible, Eleanor and Arthur sacrificed even more. They worked extra hours, emptied savings accounts, and gave up small luxuries most people never think twice about. Eleanor cleaned houses to earn additional money even after years of already sacrificing her body for everyone else. Her hands hurt constantly. Her knees ached. Her back burned after long days of scrubbing floors and carrying supplies. But she kept going because every dollar brought Michael closer to a better future. And when he graduated, she felt proud, truly proud. Watching him walk across that stage felt like proof that every difficult moment had been worth enduring. She saw his success as a family victory. She did not think of the years she had lost. She did not think about the dreams she buried. She only thought about how her son would never have to struggle the way she did. That was the tragedy of Eleanor's love. It was pure, unconditional, and endless. But because it was endless, people slowly stopped noticing it. Her sacrifices became expected rather than appreciated. The more she gave, the more invisible she became. Meals appeared on the table without anyone asking how tired she was. Clean clothes folded themselves in everyone's minds. Emotional support became something she provided automatically, like electricity coming from a wall. Nobody stopped to wonder what it cost her. Over time, Eleanor stopped existing as an individual person inside her own family. She became a role, the dependable mother, the understanding wife, the woman who never complained, the woman who always adjusted. If plans changed, she adapted. If people disappointed her, she forgave them. If she felt lonely, she swallowed it quietly. She became so good at minimizing her own needs that eventually nobody realized she had needs at all. Even as she aged, the pattern continued. When Arthur became sick, Eleanor transformed into his full-time caregiver without hesitation. She managed medications, appointments, meals, hospital visits, insurance paperwork, and sleepless nights beside hospital beds. She ignored her own declining health because there was no room for it. Arthur needed her. That was enough reason to keep pushing herself past exhaustion. She stopped eating properly. She stopped sleeping properly. Her body weakened slowly under the weight of stress and grief, but she kept functioning because she believed love required endurance. She believed caring for someone meant carrying everything alone if necessary. Michael visited occasionally, but the real burden remained on Eleanor's shoulders, and she accepted it because she had spent her entire life believing her purpose was to hold everyone else together. What makes Eleanor's story so painful is not simply that her son became distant. It is that she spent decades building her entire identity around caring for others, only to discover that care was not automatically returned. She believed love worked like planting seeds. If you nurtured people long enough, eventually, those same people would nurture you when you needed them most. But life does not always work that way. By the time she sat freezing alone in her dark house, Eleanor's body reflected every sacrifice she had ever made. The exhaustion in her bones was not only from one terrible day. It was the accumulated weight of 50 years spent ignoring herself. Every skipped meal, every sleepless night, every abandoned dream, every moment she convinced herself someone else mattered more. That is why the airport rejection hurt so deeply. It was not only about transportation. It was the sudden realization that, after a lifetime of giving everything to her family, she had become an inconvenience to them. 30 minutes of their time felt too expensive. Her grief felt disruptive. Her pain felt poorly scheduled. And yet, even in that moment, Eleanor's instinct was not anger. It was apology. She typed, "No problem," because she had trained herself her entire life to avoid burdening others. She had spent 70 years shrinking her own emotions to keep peace around her. She had become so accustomed to emotional neglect that she almost accepted dying quietly rather than asking for help again. That is what makes her eventual transformation so powerful. Surviving that night forced Eleanor to finally confront the truth she had avoided her entire life. Love without boundaries is not noble forever. At some point, constant self-sacrifice stops being kindness and becomes self-erasure. Eleanor realized she had spent decades teaching people that her needs could wait, that her pain could be minimized, and that her presence would always remain available no matter how little she received in return. For the first time in her life, she began to understand that her worth did not depend on how much she could endure for others. She was not valuable only when she was giving, cleaning, sacrificing, forgiving, or surviving. She mattered simply because she existed. And after 70 years of disappearing inside everyone else's needs, that realization changed everything. Emotional neglect rarely arrives loudly. It does not usually begin with screaming arguments, dramatic betrayals, or obvious cruelty. Most of the time, it enters quietly, disguised as busyness, distraction, stress, or simple inconvenience. That is what makes it so dangerous. People can slowly stop showing up for someone they love without even realizing the damage they are causing. In Eleanor's story, the emotional neglect she experienced did not happen in a single moment. It was built slowly over years through absence, indifference, delayed calls, forgotten visits, and the gradual erosion of care. Michael did not wake up one day deciding he no longer loved his mother. That would have been easier to recognize, easier to confront. Instead, his neglect developed in small pieces. A missed phone call here, a canceled visit there, a short text instead of a conversation, an excuse repeated so many times that eventually it became normal. Work was busy. Life was stressful. There was always another commitment, another obligation, another reason why his mother could wait a little longer. That is how emotional neglect often works in families. Nobody announces it. Nobody says, "You no longer matter to me." Instead, people slowly start treating someone's emotional needs as less urgent than everything else in their lives. Over time, the neglected person learns to stop asking for support because asking only leads to disappointment. They adapt to the absence. They shrink their expectations. They convince themselves they are being dramatic for wanting attention, comfort, or connection. Eleanor spent years doing exactly that. Every time Michael failed to call back, she found an excuse for him. Every time he skipped a visit, she minimized her own hurt. She told herself he was busy building a life. She told herself successful people naturally become occupied with work and responsibilities. She adjusted constantly because mothers are often taught that understanding and patience are proof of love. But understanding someone's behavior does not erase the pain it causes. The saddest part is that Michael probably never viewed himself as neglectful. In his mind, he still loved his mother. He still sent birthday messages. He still visited occasionally. He probably believed those actions were enough to maintain the relationship. But emotional neglect is not always about complete abandonment. Sometimes it is about giving the bare minimum while convincing yourself it counts as care. When Eleanor tried expressing her loneliness years earlier, Michael immediately became defensive. He responded the way many emotionally disconnected people respond when confronted. He focused on logistics instead of feelings. He listed the things he technically did rather than listening to what his mother was truly saying. She was not asking for constant attention. She was asking to feel emotionally important in his life again. But because emotional neglect is often invisible to the people causing it, he interpreted her pain as unreasonable neediness instead of legitimate hurt. Jessica intensified that problem. Her criticism came wrapped in politeness, but underneath it was judgment. She viewed Eleanor through the lens of inconvenience, age, and inadequacy. Every comment about Eleanor's clothes, house, or lifestyle reinforced the idea that Eleanor existed beneath them socially and financially. Those remarks may have seemed small individually, but repeated over years, they created emotional distance and humiliation. One of the most heartbreaking elements of the story is how Eleanor internalized this treatment. Instead of becoming angry early on, she became quieter. She started apologizing for her own needs. She worried constantly about burdening others. That is one of the clearest signs of emotional neglect. People begin feeling guilty simply for wanting care. They stop believing they deserve attention because they have spent so long receiving so little of it. The airport scene captures this perfectly. Eleanor had just buried her husband of 43 years. She was physically exhausted, emotionally shattered, financially strained, and completely alone. Yet even then, her request remained painfully small. She did not ask her son to stay with her for weeks. She did not ask for emotional speeches or grand gestures. She simply asked for a ride home from the airport, 30 minutes of effort from the people closest to her. Michael's response was cold not because of profanity or cruelty in tone, but because of how emotionally detached it was. "We're swamped. Call an Uber." The sentence lacked warmth, compassion, or even curiosity about how she was feeling. It treated her situation like a scheduling inconvenience instead of a moment of grief and vulnerability. Jessica's response made it worse by framing Eleanor's suffering as poor planning. Rather than recognizing the emotional chaos of losing a spouse, she reduced it to a logistical failure. That moment became devastating because it exposed the truth Eleanor had been avoiding for years. Her emotional needs no longer mattered to the people she loved most. She was expected to manage her pain privately, efficiently, and without interrupting anyone else's comfort. What makes emotional neglect so psychologically destructive is that it creates loneliness even when people technically still exist around you. Eleanor had a son. She had extended family. She had contacts in her phone. Yet she felt completely abandoned because emotional presence was missing. Human beings do not survive emotionally on technical relationships alone. We need care that feels active, visible, and sincere. The contrast between Eleanor's freezing house and Michael's warm living room symbolized this perfectly. Physically, Michael was only 20 miles away. Emotionally, he was unreachable. While Eleanor sat alone wrapped in blankets, Michael and Jessica posted smiling photos beside their fireplace. They were not thinking about whether she had arrived safely, whether she had eaten, or whether she needed help. Their comfort existed beside her suffering without interruption. And that is the terrifying reality of emotional neglect. Someone can genuinely believe they are a decent person while remaining completely disconnected from another person's pain. Michael did not intend to nearly kill his mother, but neglect does not require evil intentions to create devastating consequences. Indifference alone can destroy people. Eleanor's reaction throughout the night also revealed how deeply neglect changes a person psychologically. Even while recognizing she was in danger, she resisted asking for help. She did not want to inconvenience anyone. She preferred risking death over becoming emotionally burdensome again. That mindset did not develop overnight. It came from years of feeling dismissed whenever she expressed emotional needs. By the time Artie found her, Eleanor had already emotionally accepted isolation as normal. That is why his actions became so powerful. He noticed her absence. He worried when the porch light stayed off. He checked on her repeatedly. He paid attention. In many ways, Artie's compassion highlighted just how severe Michael's neglect had become. A neighbor with no obligation showed more emotional awareness in one night than her own family had shown in years. The media reaction inside the story also reflects something deeply human. People were not outraged only because Eleanor nearly died. They were outraged because many recognized the emotional truth behind her experience. Countless elderly parents experience similar forms of quiet abandonment every day. Their children may still call occasionally, still send gifts during holidays, still technically remain in contact, but emotionally they feel forgotten. Modern life often normalizes emotional distance. People become consumed by careers, routines, social status, technology, and personal convenience. Family relationships become reduced to occasional updates and obligations rather than genuine connection. Elderly parents especially become vulnerable to this because society frequently treats aging itself as an inconvenience. Eleanor's story forces people to confront uncomfortable questions. How many times do we assume someone is fine because they are quiet? How often do we confuse minimal effort with meaningful love? How many relationships slowly deteriorate because nobody notices the emotional absence growing inside them? The most painful truth is that emotional neglect often becomes visible only after a crisis occurs. Michael did not fully recognize what he had become until he saw his mother's suffering exposed publicly. It took the possibility of losing her forever to break through the emotional numbness he had built over years of prioritizing everything else above their relationship. And that is why emotional neglect is so dangerous. It rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It feels ordinary. Busy schedules, missed calls, delayed visits, quick responses, emotional shortcuts, small dismissals. But over time, those seemingly harmless moments accumulate until one person is left sitting alone in the cold, wondering when exactly they stopped mattering to the people they loved most. Losing a life partner after decades together is not simply sadness. It is the destruction of an entire way of living. When someone spends 43 years beside the same person, their routines, habits, identity, and sense of safety become deeply connected to that relationship. Every morning has shared rituals. Every room in the house carries memories. Even silence feels familiar because it belongs to two people who learned how to exist together over time. When that person dies, the surviving partner does not just lose companionship. They lose the structure of their emotional world. For Eleanor, Arthur was not only her husband. He was stability after abandonment. He was the man who stepped into her chaotic life when she was exhausted, struggling, and emotionally wounded. He helped raise Michael, worked beside her through financial hardship, and built a modest but loving life with her. Over the years, Arthur became the person who consistently saw Eleanor not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as someone precious and worth protecting. That is why his death shattered her so completely. She had already spent months watching him slowly disappear through illness. Caregiving itself is emotionally devastating because it forces someone to live in constant fear while suppressing their own needs. Eleanor slept in hospital chairs, monitored medications, handled appointments, and stayed emotionally alert every hour of the day. She was grieving Arthur long before he actually died because serious illness slowly transforms relationships. The person is physically present, but little by little the future disappears. When death finally came, Eleanor had no energy left. Grief after caregiving often carries a special kind of exhaustion. The surviving person is emotionally broken, physically drained, and psychologically numb all at once. There is no recovery period before responsibilities begin. Funerals must be organized. Calls must be answered. Travel must happen. Paperwork appears immediately. The grieving person barely has time to understand what happened before the world expects them to function again. That is what makes Eleanor's loneliness so devastating. The day she buried her husband should have been the moment her family surrounded her with care. Instead, it became the moment she realized how alone she truly was. Her son's refusal to pick her up from the airport hurt because it exposed a terrifying truth. Arthur had been the last emotional shelter in her life. Once he was gone, there was nobody left actively protecting her emotional well-being. Loneliness after loss is different from ordinary loneliness. It is not simply the absence of people. It is the absence of the one person who knew your entire history without explanation. Arthur knew Eleanor before the wrinkles, before the exhaustion, before the disappointments. He knew the younger version of her that had dreams and energy and hope. He knew her habits, fears, moods, and silences. After 43 years together, they no longer needed to explain themselves constantly because their lives had become deeply intertwined. When Eleanor returned to the dark house after the funeral, every object inside reminded her of that absence. The sofa where they watched movies together, the kitchen where they cooked Sunday meals, the bed where they slept beside each other for decades. Grief transforms familiar spaces into emotional minefields because memories exist everywhere. Even ordinary sounds become painful. Silence itself becomes unbearable because the surviving partner is constantly aware of what is missing. What makes this even more tragic is that Eleanor did not only lose Arthur physically. She lost the last person who regularly cared for her emotionally. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that Arthur worried about her in ways nobody else did. Even during his illness, he still reached for her hand at night. He still thought about whether she was comfortable. He still recognized her humanity beyond her role as caregiver. That emotional recognition matters deeply in long-term relationships. Many elderly couples survive not because life becomes easier with age, but because they become each other's emotional anchors. They share fears privately. They reassure one another. They create a sense of continuity against the instability of aging. When one partner dies, the surviving person often feels emotionally untethered from life itself. Eleanor's loneliness became especially dangerous because it existed alongside physical vulnerability. She was 70 years old, exhausted, malnourished, emotionally devastated, and financially strained. Yet she returned home completely alone. Nobody checked whether she had food. Nobody checked whether the house was warm. Nobody stayed with her through the night. That level of isolation after major loss is psychologically and physically dangerous, especially for elderly people. The freezing house becomes symbolic of her emotional condition. There was no warmth left anywhere in her life. Not in the empty rooms. Not in the silence surrounding her. not in the messages from her family. Even the furnace failing seemed like the universe physically manifesting the emotional abandonment she already felt inside. One of the most painful details in the story is Eleanor's inability to ask for help. Grief often creates emotional paralysis. The person becomes so overwhelmed that even simple decisions feel impossible. She knew she needed warmth, food, and assistance, but her body and mind had reached total exhaustion. That exhaustion was not weakness. It was the result of prolonged caregiving stress, emotional trauma, and severe loneliness collapsing together at once. The human mind is not designed to process profound grief in isolation. People need witnesses to their pain. They need comfort, reassurance, and practical care. Without those things, grief can become physically dangerous. Eleanor slowly stopped fighting for herself because she no longer felt emotionally connected to anyone around her. The desire to survive weakens when a person feels invisible. That is why her dream about Arthur during the hypothermia episode feels so heartbreaking. Even in her fading consciousness, her mind returned to the last place she remembered feeling safe. She imagined him warning her, telling her to get up, telling her to ask for help. Deep down, part of her still wanted to survive, but the loneliness surrounding her had already convinced her that survival no longer mattered much to anyone else. Loneliness after loss often creates a terrifying emotional contradiction. A grieving person desperately wants comfort, yet simultaneously feels like a burden for needing it. Eleanor's refusal to call anyone reflected this perfectly. She had already been made to feel inconvenient by her own son earlier that day. Asking for additional help now felt emotionally humiliating. So instead of reaching outward, she retreated inward. That withdrawal nearly killed her. What saved Eleanor in the end was not blood relation, wealth, or obligation. It was human attention. Artie noticed her absence. He recognized that something felt wrong. He cared enough to act. That simple act of concern interrupted the deadly isolation swallowing her whole. The emotional power of the hospital scenes comes from contrast. While Michael slept comfortably unaware of his mother's condition, Artie sat awake in a waiting room worried about her survival. That contrast exposed the emotional emptiness surrounding Eleanor's family relationships. The people who should have naturally protected her were emotionally absent, while a neighbor stepped into the role her own family abandoned. The story also reveals something broader about aging and grief in modern society. Many elderly people experience profound loneliness after losing a spouse because their social worlds shrink dramatically over time. Friends die. Children become busy. Communities weaken. The surviving partner is often left navigating grief largely alone, while everyone else returns to normal life much faster than they can. Eleanor's experience resonated so strongly because it reflects a fear many people secretly carry. The fear that after giving everything to family for decades, they might eventually become emotionally disposable. The fear that when the person who loves them most dies, nobody else will truly notice their suffering. But the story also shows how loneliness can awaken self-awareness. Surviving that night forced Eleanor to confront truths she had avoided for years. She realized she deserved care, attention, and dignity. She realized love should not require self-erasure. And perhaps most importantly, she realized that surviving grief did not mean returning to invisibility. It meant rebuilding a life where her own needs finally mattered. One of the most painful truths in life is that blood relationships do not automatically guarantee compassion. People grow up believing family will always be the safest place to fall during moments of crisis, grief, or vulnerability. We are taught that relatives will naturally show up when life becomes unbearable. But reality is often more complicated. Sometimes the people connected to us by blood become emotionally distant, distracted, or incapable of offering the care we need. And sometimes complete strangers step forward with more humanity, empathy, and loyalty than the people who share our last name. Eleanor's story reveals this truth in the most devastating way possible. Her own son, the child she sacrificed everything for, failed to notice her suffering when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Artie, a 75-year-old neighbor with no obligation to her at all, became the person who saved her life. That contrast is what gives the story so much emotional power. It forces people to question what truly defines family. Is it biology, or is it the willingness to care when someone is at their weakest? Artie was not a dramatic hero. He was simply attentive, and sometimes attention itself becomes an act of love. He noticed the porch light staying off. He noticed the house looking too dark, too quiet, too lifeless. He remembered Arthur mentioning the funeral weeks earlier. He paid attention to details because he genuinely cared about the people living around him. While Eleanor's own family moved through their evening focused entirely on themselves, Artie remained emotionally aware of another person's existence. That awareness mattered more than anything. The tragedy is that Michael and Jessica probably believed they were still good people. They likely saw themselves as busy professionals managing stressful lives. In their minds, Eleanor was stable, independent, and capable of taking care of herself. They did not intentionally wish harm on her. But the difference between them and Artie is that Artie stayed emotionally connected to another human being's vulnerability. He did not assume everything was fine simply because nobody complained loudly. That is often what separates genuine compassion from performative concern. Truly compassionate people notice absences. They notice unusual silence. They remember routines. They pay attention when something feels wrong. Artie knew Arthur always left the porch light on. He knew Eleanor had traveled alone to a funeral. He knew grief changes people physically and emotionally. Those small observations created enough concern for him to act. Michael, on the other hand, never even checked whether his mother arrived home safely. What makes Artie's actions especially meaningful is that he himself was elderly. At 75 years old, he likely had his own physical limitations, his own aches, fears, and exhaustion. Yet he still crossed the street, knocked repeatedly, called her phone, and eventually broke down her door to save her. He did not wait for someone younger or more responsible to handle it. He acted because another human being needed help. That level of compassion exposes something deeply important about human connection. Real care is rarely measured by grand speeches or public declarations. It is measured through presence, attention, and action. Artie did not post emotional messages online. He did not speak dramatically about loyalty or family values. He simply stayed. He noticed. He acted. Meanwhile, Eleanor's actual family had become emotionally disconnected despite years of shared history and sacrifice. That contrast highlights how relationships can slowly become hollow when convenience replaces emotional responsibility. Michael still technically had a relationship with his mother. He called occasionally. He visited sometimes. But emotionally, he had stopped truly seeing her. She existed in the background of his life rather than at the center of his concern. Artie saw her more clearly in one night than Michael had seen her in years. There is also something profoundly moving about the fact that Artie acted partly because of a promise to Arthur. Before his death, Arthur worried about Eleanor being left alone. Even while dying, he was still thinking about protecting her. He trusted Artie enough to ask him to watch over her if anything happened. That request says a great deal about the emotional reality Arthur likely understood long before Eleanor fully admitted it to herself. He knew Michael had drifted away emotionally. He knew Eleanor would struggle alone. Artie honored that promise without hesitation. The emotional significance of this cannot be overstated. In many ways, Artie represented the kind of loyalty Eleanor thought family was supposed to provide. He became proof that genuine humanity still existed even after her faith in her own family had been shattered. When he sat in the hospital waiting room all night, refusing to leave until she was stable, he demonstrated a level of emotional commitment that Michael had failed to show during Arthur's entire illness. That waiting room scene quietly reveals the true meaning of care. Care is inconvenience willingly accepted for someone else's well-being. It is staying awake when you could go home. It is worrying about someone when nobody would blame you for minding your own business. It is carrying emotional responsibility even when there is no reward for doing so. Artie gained nothing from helping Eleanor. There was no social benefit, financial reward, or obligation attached to his actions. He simply could not ignore another person suffering alone. The story also challenges modern ideas about independence and isolation. Many people today live beside neighbors they barely know. Communities have weakened in countless places. People often assume emotional support should come exclusively from family, while ignoring the value of human connection outside blood relationships. But Eleanor survived because of community, because one neighbor still believed other people mattered. That idea resonates deeply because many elderly individuals experience emotional abandonment even while surrounded by family members living relatively close by. Adult children become consumed by careers, routines, and personal responsibilities. Over time, parents become emotionally peripheral. Meanwhile, neighbors, support groups, church members, or local communities sometimes become the only people consistently paying attention. Artie's compassion also gave Eleanor something she had lost long before that freezing night: visibility. He saw her pain. He recognized her vulnerability. He treated her life as valuable and urgent. That emotional recognition became healing in ways even medical treatment could not fully provide. For years, Eleanor had slowly disappeared inside her own family dynamics. Her sacrifices became expected. Her loneliness became minimized. Her emotional needs became inconvenient. But Artie treated her suffering as something that mattered immediately. He did not question whether she was overreacting. He did not accuse her of being dramatic. He responded instinctively with care. That response helped Eleanor begin rebuilding her sense of self-worth. The hospital conversations between them feel powerful because they contain something Eleanor desperately needed: emotional safety. Artie listened without judgment. He reassured her without dismissing her pain. He remained physically present. In many ways, his compassion helped interrupt the emotional isolation that had nearly killed her. And perhaps most importantly, Artie never tried to make Eleanor feel guilty for needing help. That distinction matters enormously. Emotionally neglected people often become terrified of burdening others. They apologize constantly. They minimize their own pain. But truly compassionate people create spaces where vulnerability feels acceptable rather than shameful. Artie did that naturally. The story ultimately suggests that family should not be defined solely through genetics or legal relationships. Family is built through reliability, empathy, and emotional presence. It is built through the people who notice when your light stays off too long, the people who knock on your door when something feels wrong, the people who stay in waiting rooms through the night because they genuinely cannot rest while you are suffering. By the end of the story, Eleanor begins understanding this truth for herself. The neighbors repairing her furnace, the social workers helping her recover, and Artie standing beside her all became evidence that she was not invisible after all. Human connection still existed around her. Compassion still existed around her. It simply did not arrive from the people she originally expected it to come from. And that realization changed her understanding of love completely. She no longer measured love by promises, titles, or blood relations alone. She measured it through actions, through presence, through who stayed when staying was difficult, through who noticed her pain without needing to be asked. Because sometimes the people who save your life are not the ones who raised you, married you, or share your blood. Sometimes they are simply the people who choose not to walk away when everyone else already has. The first thing Eleanor noticed when she walked back into her home was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, not the comforting quiet she and Arthur used to share while reading in separate chairs on winter evenings. This silence felt different, heavy, empty, like the house itself had changed after everything that happened. 3 months earlier, she had nearly died on that same sofa. 3 months earlier, She had closed her eyes believing nobody was coming for her. Now the furnace hummed softly through the vents. Warm air drifted through the rooms. Fresh curtains hung near the windows. Someone had replaced the broken porch light. The neighbors had even cleaned the yard after a storm passed through the week before. The house no longer looked abandoned. But Eleanor still carried pieces of that night inside her. Artie stood beside her holding a cardboard box filled with groceries. "It feels warmer already," he said with a small smile. Eleanor looked around slowly. "It feels alive again." Michael entered behind them carrying another box. He looked tired, but not in the careless way she used to remember. This was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from effort, from trying, from showing up every day even when it was uncomfortable. "Where do you want these?" he asked carefully. "In the kitchen," Eleanor answered. He nodded immediately and carried the box inside without another word. Months ago Michael would have sighed, complained, looked distracted while checking his phone. Now he listened, truly listened. It was still strange for Eleanor to witness. Artie leaned closer and whispered jokingly, "Your son, becoming useful." Eleanor laughed softly for the first time that morning. That laugh mattered more than anyone realized. Because after trauma, joy does not return all at once. It returns quietly, carefully, in tiny moments that almost go unnoticed. A warm cup of tea. A repaired light bulb. A neighbor knocking just to ask if you need anything. A son finally learning how to care. Healing rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it arrives disguised as ordinary moments. Michael returned from the kitchen. "I also brought those extra blankets you liked," he said. "You remembered. You mentioned them twice." Eleanor stared at him for a moment. For years she had spoken without feeling heard, like her words simply floated past people without landing anywhere. But now Michael remembered details, small details, her favorite tea brand, the way she preferred extra blankets folded near the couch, the medications she needed after breakfast instead of before. Things a loving son should know. Things he was only now beginning to learn. Jessica arrived shortly after carrying a small potted plant wrapped in brown paper. "I didn't know if you'd want flowers," she said nervously. "Flowers die quickly, so I thought maybe something alive would be better." Eleanor looked at the little green plant. It was simple, not expensive, not dramatic, but thoughtful. And somehow that mattered more. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said honestly. Jessica's shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension between them had not disappeared completely. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. There were still awkward pauses, still guilt lingering behind Jessica's eyes whenever their conversations drifted toward the past. But something had changed. Jessica no longer spoke to Eleanor like an inconvenience. She spoke to her like a person. And sometimes that difference changes everything. That evening, the neighbors came by one after another. Mrs. Hernandez from across the street brought homemade soup. The Johnson boys helped carry furniture back into place. Even quiet Mr. Lewis from the corner house stopped by just to say, "Glad you're still with us." Before the hypothermia incident, Eleanor barely knew these people. They had all lived near each other for years, waving politely from a distance without truly connecting. But tragedy has a strange way of revealing who cares. And survival has a strange way of building community. Later that night, after everyone left, Eleanor sat in her living room wrapped in a soft sweater while snow fell gently outside the window. Artie sat across from her drinking coffee. Michael quietly repaired a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. The sound made Eleanor smile. For so long she had feared becoming a burden, an unwanted responsibility passed from person to person. But now she understood something important. Needing people is not weakness. Pretending you need nobody is. I keep thinking about that night, Eleanor admitted quietly. Artie looked up immediately. So do I, he said. I almost gave up. But you didn't. I wanted to. Michael stopped moving in the kitchen. The room became still. Eleanor stared into her cup. I was so tired. I truly believed nobody cared whether I lived or died. Michael walked slowly back into the living room. His face carried pain she recognized immediately. Regret. I cared, he whispered. She looked at him carefully. I know that now, she answered gently. But love that is never shown begins to feel invisible. Michael sat down across from her. I think I spent years assuming there would always be more time. Eleanor said nothing. More birthdays, more holidays, more chances to visit, more chances to call. I kept acting like you'd always be there waiting no matter how little effort I made. His eyes filled with tears again. And then suddenly I almost lost you. Eleanor watched her son quietly. People often imagine forgiveness as one magical moment, one emotional speech where everything instantly heals. Real forgiveness is slower. It happens in conversations, in changed behavior, in consistency, in effort repeated over time. Michael had not magically erased the past, but every day he was trying to become someone different. And that mattered. You know what hurt most? Eleanor asked softly. Michael looked down. Everything. No, she shook her head gently. Not the airport, not the cold, not even being alone. Her voice trembled slightly. What hurt most was believing I mattered so little. Michael covered his face with his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered again. Eleanor leaned back slowly. When you're young, you think love is automatic in families, that blood guarantees care. She paused. But now I think love is a choice people make every day. Artie nodded quietly. Some people choose well, Eleanor continued, and some people forget. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then Michael looked at her with red eyes and asked, Do you think you'll ever fully forgive me? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Finally, she answered honestly. I think forgiveness is possible, but trust takes longer. Michael nodded slowly. I understand. And rebuilding a relationship is not about grand gestures, she added. It's about consistency, small things, calls, visits, showing up when it matters. I'll keep showing up. I know. And for the first time in many years, Eleanor truly believed him. Winter slowly turned into spring. The snow disappeared. The flowers returned. Life kept moving. Eleanor began attending the widow support group every Thursday afternoon. At first, she barely spoke. She simply listened to other women describe loneliness, grief, invisible heartbreaks hidden behind polite smiles. Then one afternoon she shared her own story. Not the media version. Not the dramatic headlines. The real version. The fear. The silence. The feeling of becoming invisible inside her own family. When she finished speaking, another woman across the room quietly started crying. Then another. After the meeting, several women approached Eleanor one by one. You described exactly how I feel. I thought I was the only one. My children barely call anymore too. That was when Eleanor realized her story was never just about her. It was about aging, about loneliness, about how easily society overlooks older people once they stop being convenient. And she decided she would never stay silent about it again. A local community center, later, invited her to speak during a family awareness event. Michael attended quietly from the back row. So did Jessica. So did Artie. Eleanor stood at the podium with trembling hands at first, but once she began speaking, her voice grew stronger. I almost died because I convinced myself asking for help made me a burden. She told the audience, and my family almost lost me because they convinced themselves there would always be another day to care. The room became completely silent. We are all busy, Eleanor continued. We all have schedules and responsibilities and stress, but one day the people who love us will be gone. And when that happens, no career achievement, no dinner reservation, no perfect evening by the fireplace will matter more than the moments we failed to show up for the people who needed us. Michael cried openly while listening. Not from humiliation anymore. From understanding. After the event ended, a young woman approached Eleanor holding her mother's hand tightly. "We're going to visit my grandmother tonight," she said softly. "Your story reminded me not to wait." Eleanor smiled through tears. Then she looked toward Michael, standing near the doorway. He walked toward her slowly. "You helped people today," he said. "So did you." He looked confused. "You changed," Eleanor explained, "and people can learn from that too. Because redemption matters. People fail. Sometimes terribly. Sometimes selfishly. Sometimes in ways that leave permanent scars. But human beings also have the ability to grow if they are willing to face the truth about themselves. Not everyone changes, but some do. And Michael was trying. One evening months later, Eleanor sat on her porch wrapped in a blanket while the sunset painted the neighborhood gold. Artie sat beside her. Michael was in the yard fixing the fence. Jessica was planting flowers near the walkway. Laughter drifted through the cool evening air. Not perfection, but effort. Not a flawless family, but a healing one. Eleanor looked at the glowing porch light above her door and smiled softly. Arthur used to leave that light on every night. A signal that home was waiting. That someone cared whether you returned safely. Now she finally understood something important. Home is not a building. It is not a perfect family photo. It is not appearances. Home is wherever people choose to care for each other consistently, honestly, and without conditions. And the moral of Eleanor's story is simple. Never wait for tragedy to remind you to love people properly. Call your parents. Check on your neighbors. Notice the lonely people quietly suffering around you. Because sometimes a 5-minute act of kindness can save a life. And sometimes the people who feel invisible are only waiting for someone to prove they matter. Disclaimer. This story is a fictionalized dramatic narrative created for emotional storytelling and entertainment purposes. While it reflects real-life themes such as grief, aging, loneliness, family conflict, and emotional neglect, the characters and events are creatively adapted to deliver a meaningful message. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may feel emotionally intense or personally relatable to certain audiences.